and Lucretius, and it goes through Galileo and Newton and Spinoza and Voltaire and Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine and Albert Einstein. We have a tradition that by all means understands about the transcendent, about the awe-inspiring. We have the Hubble telescope. We have the pages of Stephen Hawking. We have the extraordinary ethical scientism of Albert Einstein. We have nothing to be ashamed of. We have something really nutritious, the beauties of science and reason and the consolations of philosophy to offer people, and we're expected to be impressed by those who talk about the burning bush. So, time for resistance. To the extent that I can help to ignite it, I'm very proud for myself. To the extent that you might want to join in, I hope you will all consider yourselves incredibly welcome. Thank you so much for coming.
Mr. Hitchens, I wonder if I could trouble you for a couple of things.
By all means.
Like you, I'm a refugee from the Church of England, which Alistair MacIntyre described on the front of Encanto in about 1960 when Honest to God came out as, "It is the Englishman's religion that there is no God, and it's useful to pray to him from time to time." These are the chains we have to shake. First of all, as to the power of prayer, I'd like you to comment on the thought that it is actually demonstrated by Pat Robertson, who prays for more space on the Supreme Court, whereupon Rehnquist drops dead. This merely proves that Pat Robertson is a bad shot. And secondly, and more seriously, what comfort can you give us after all these terrific oratory, and I appreciate it, that you will not do a Malcolm Muggeridge on us and wind up an ass on the back of a donkey on BBC Two, traipsing around the Holy Land, mouthing sanctimonious pomposities.
Love it. My only dissent from you is I don't think Episcopalianism, Anglicanism, is as innocuous as all that. Yeah, I can quote you something from memory. Who said the following and when? A nuclear war would have no more effect than moving millions of people into paradise a little sooner than they would otherwise get there. Who said that? And when? Who would you guess? You would guess it was some inquisitorial Rafsanjani figure, wouldn't you? Talking about. Now, that is good. That is good. He is very good. Man's good. No one else would guess. I think that was the Archbishop of Canterbury in 1964. But he has to believe it, doesn't he? Because if he doesn't want this veil of tears to come to an end, he's not really a Christian. All we're doing here is wasting our time with our culture, our irony, our literature, and so on. That's all trash. What we really want is to be dead. And I might add, lots of other people too. On the second point, I can be won over. I can be won over the second point. George Herbert, our greatest, I think you might agree with this too, our greatest national religious poet, along with John Donne. I couldn't be without these authors. It's not that I have no sense of the numinous or the transcendent. Of course I do. Devotional music works, some of it, for me. Philip Larkin's poem on church-going is one of the most beautiful things I've ever read. George Herbert refers to the sweet mediocrity of our native church. I think he understates things a little bit. My line on it, and actually I owe the last question, a partial answer to. He asked, do I think they're all the same, all religions are the same? And as I said last night on the box, the answer is this, yes. Though a Quaker is obviously very different from a member of the Taliban, and it's nonetheless the case that all religions, all faiths are equal glimpses of the same untruth. And they all involve the same surrender of reason and the reasoning faculty, and they involve the same contempt for evidence, and they involve the idea that one must respect someone for saying, I'll believe anything I'm told. I can't go that way. I'm the man to whom Pascal is writing when in his Pensées. He says he's addressing those who are so made they cannot believe. Well, there are more of us than you might think. And even Anglicanism can produce a hateful archbishop who has to say this about nuclear war in England in the 1960s. My analogy for it would be, and I wish I'd put it in the book, La Peste, Albert Camus, the plague. Finally, he says, as you'll remember it, the plague is over, the rats have died or disappeared. The city of Oran has returned to health. The Mediterranean is shimmering again. The white buildings have been cleaned. The people are back on the streets. But he says, and yet the rats were only down in the sewers and waiting for the day when they could once again send themselves up to die on the streets of a free city. As long as the faith-based are around, you do not know that they will not turn their rationality to account. And it can come to you from the Pope, it can come to you from the Archbishop of Canterbury, it can come to you from what had been for a long time a very pacific and passive religion. Shia Islam can suddenly proclaim an Ayatollah and the end of the world and the coming of the 12th Imam. You don't know. While that remains the case, I think it's right to be as skeptical of any belief as it is of any other one. On the Muggeridge point, I debated the old fool a few times on the box, and then he stopped because he did a program called In the Steps of St. Paul, of himself waddling around the Middle East with a man called Alec Vidler, who was then the Dean of Kings in Cambridge. Quite a nice old, furry old, white-haired old dean, toddling along the steps of St. Paul, and I wrote a review in which I titled it Vidler on the Hoof. And that was it for Malcolm and me.
Mr. Hitchens, I've appreciated very much your fierce and courageous support of the U.S. effort in Iraq. I raise that issue only to note that in my estimation, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, the same ideology, really secular ideology, that animated Saddam Hussein was also the animus, the sort of spirit behind the quenching of 100 million souls in the 20th century. When Solzhenitsyn said in receiving the Templeton Prize in 1983 that when asked, why has all of this happened, his response was, men have forgotten God. And I wonder, in your characterization of religion as only a dictatorship, a kind of absolute, permanent dictatorship, is there anything good about religion? That is would you admit that there is an admixture of both good and evil, or is the spirit of religion only one of evil? And I wonder if you might address this within the context of 20th century totalitarianism, especially.
Absolutely, and thank you. Well, the spirit of simple credulity, for example, the humble faith, the person who puts his faith in God and tries to arrange his life and that of his family according to precept, is not evil at all. But simple credulity can be evil for this reason. Someone who can see that there are millions of credulous people around will soon take advantage of the fact and will soon find a way to do so. So the struggle between people who think like me and our rivals, our enemies, is the struggle to raise the culture to the level where people are immune to appeals made by the cynical to the credulous. And I'll instance that further in replying to the rest of your question. If you take the case of the communist revolution in Russia, until 1917, for centuries, the majority of impoverished, enclaved Russians had been taught that their Tsar was not just an absolutist monarch, he certainly was that. He owned everything and everybody in the country, but that he was also the head of the Russian Orthodox Church and something a little more than human in his authority. If you were Joseph Stalin, inheriting a vast reservoir of credulity and backwardness like that, and having been trained as he was in a Russian Orthodox seminary, he could have been a great bishop if he'd concentrated a bit harder. You would be nuts not to exploit an opportunity of that kind. I mean, there you are. You have a ready-made, Christian-provided mob of people who want a czar and want a god. Well, that's easily supplied. No country's ever fallen into despotism and misery because it followed the teachings of Spinoza and Thomas Jefferson and Albert Einstein. You see what I mean? I can go on about this if you want.
Well, perhaps if I might just follow
up.
But
I think, don't you think that's a fair answer to your question, as posed?
Well,
and by the way, I find it interesting because this comes up at every meeting I've ever had and every argument. That's why there's a whole chapter in my book about it. The Christians are feeling a bit on the defensive now, and the religious in general, and they keep bringing this up as if to say, okay, we're not that great, but at least we're not fascists and Nazis. Well, I would want to say a bit more for myself than that, I've got to say. And as a secularist, I don't have to make that decision.